This is Jon Rivers. We'd like you to join us for a very special event. CCM Magazine's History of Christian Music. A fascinating look at the birth and growth of contemporary Christian music and the magazine that has covered it for 2 decades.
I believe in God the Father, just between you and me. Lead me on, and friends of friends forever. I don't love, all my love. But you're gonna have to serve somebody. But if I can't swim after 40 days, give your praise to the Lord. Come on, everybody.
We'll be featuring interviews and commentary, reliving experiences, and playing music from a variety of Christian artists.
Just put this love in my heart. There's a bridge to cross the great divide. I surrender all. Why should the devil have all the good music? Come and go with me to my Father's house. I listen to the trumpet of Jesus. Hear the bells ringing, bells singing that we can be born again. God is in control.
You will hear familiar favorites from the past 20 years, as well as a number of rare recordings.
There's a rainbow somewhere. Got an angel riding shotgun. Where the blind ones see and the dry bones dance. Little country church on the edge of town. A crucified road. That's the Lord. Oh, my soul. Oh, my brother, you're my sister.
Throughout the next several hours, we'll highlight the top 100 contemporary Christian albums of all time, as selected by a distinguished panel of journalists and music critics. CCM Magazine dates its beginning to July 1978. But contemporary Christian music goes back at least another decade. Of course, the music you would have heard in those days was nothing like you would hear now by Jars of Clay, DC Talk, or even Amy Grant.
What's going on?
You haven't heard?
Sounds like fun. What's the word?
Hear that?
Hear what?
Hear that bass?
Hear man.
In the stars his handiwork I see. On the wind he speaks with majesty.
The transition from traditional church music to what became known as contemporary Christian music began in the mid-1960s with the advent of youth musicals and folk masses. But what we now define as contemporary Christian music was just as much a product of the turbulent 1960s protest era as it was the church. The movement reached its zenith at the historic Woodstock Music and Arts Festival in 1969, one of several milestone events in 1969.
By the time we got to Woodstock, we were heavily strong. And everywhere was a song and a celebration.
The Beatles performed their final public concert. Elvis Presley had his last #1 record, and astronaut Neil Armstrong took one giant leap for mankind onto the surface of the moon. Back on Earth, the counterculture movement began to impact the church.
Forget your hexagram. You'll soon feel fine. Stop looking at the stars. You don't live under the sign.
Christian music took one giant leap in 1969 as well. A young singer-songwriter from San Jose, California named Larry Norman recorded an album called Upon This Rock for Capitol Records. It was a revolutionary statement of faith voiced in authentic rock terms. Upon This Rock is recognized as one of the very first Jesus rock albums. Larry Norman recalls Capitol Records' reaction to his transition from the pop band People to his solo Christian music recording.
They kept saying, we don't like what you're doing. Don't write this Jesus music stuff. Please, write about girls. We're going to renew your contract. We're going to give you another album, but make this next album about girls. Don't write about Jesus, you know. So the next album was about Jesus, and they said, okay, we're going to have to drop you. Well, we don't want to drop you. We're going to renew your contract. We're not going to make another album. Write about romance, please, you know. They didn't know how to, what you might call, market this music. There wasn't really a public for it.
Because a lifetime filled with happiness is like a street that never ends. Alright, sing that sweet, sweet song of salvation and let your laughter fill the air.
Sing that sweet, sweet song of salvation.
Tell the people everywhere.
Sing that sweet, sweet song of salvation.
Every man, you can take away my kids, take away my wife, take away my job, you can take away my life, you can take away my house, take away my Ford, but you can't take away the Lord. Now, listen, Satan.
In 1970, another young musical rebel named Mylon Lefevre began writing his own chapter in the history of Christian rock. Mylon was a member of the Singing Lefevres, one of the best-known Southern gospel groups of that time. But Mylon, still a teenager, wanted to write and perform music in a style that would speak to his peers.
I don't want you to refuse, no, and I don't want you to refuse. I want you to love, not hate, understand and appreciate what he's done for me and you. But please don't get those Sunday school blues.
So, with the encouragement of Word Records, Mylon began recording a solo album. But Word rejected the radical intensity of Mylon's blues rock approach, so Lefevre sold the tapes to mainstream label Cotillion Records. That album, simply called Mylon, was even closer to the street-level rock of the day than Norman's Upon This Rock.
He knows where you've been, he knows what you've done, he knows when you're lost, he knows when you won, he knows how you feel, he hears what you say, and he can lift you up and he'll show you the way.
Mylon, from his 1970 self-titled solo album. In the early 1970s, the interest in Christianity and Christian music was building. In Orange County, just south of Los Angeles, California, a new church called Calvary Chapel opened its doors, holding mass baptisms in the nearby Pacific Ocean.
He that believeth and is baptized shall be saved. So today we make the next
Calvary
step.
Chapel's
Already
pastor,
come
Chuck
forward to
Smith,
accept Jesus
recognized that faith in Christ had more to do with the condition of one's heart than with the length of one's hair, the appearance of one's clothing, or the type of music used to convey the gospel message. Consequently, Pastor Chuck encouraged the musicians in his fellowship to make a joyful noise unto the Lord in whatever style they were familiar with. In fact, one of the more popular early groups wrote a song about Calvary Chapel.
Little country church on the edge of town. People coming every day from miles around, for meetings and for Sunday school. And it's very plain to see, it's not the way it used to be.
The enthusiasm teenagers and young adults were showing for their newfound faith in Jesus and this new musical style swept through Southern California and around the nation. The Jesus movement, as it was dubbed by the media, became front-page news across the country. Music, the unifying force of the 1960s, was the natural medium of expression for this new generation of believers. Author-musician John Fisher made his first Christian albums in the 1960s.
I knew that, there was a kind of a daring nature to it, because I knew much of the church was probably not going to know what to do with guitars even, and with a beat and that kind of thing. And yet, for me, it wedded with a kind of radical nature of faith that a lot of us were experiencing at the time, too. I mean, Jesus was, to us, he was the ultimate hippie.
On your own, you'll always end up going way of all flesh. There is a way that seems right to man.
In 1971, Calvary Chapel began a recording outreach known as Maranatha Music, with the release of the Everlasting Livin' Jesus Music Concert. Michael W. Smith recalls that as being one of the first Christian albums he purchased.
The Everlasting Living Jesus Music Concert was the very first Christian album that I had, which I thought was so extraordinary as a kid, because everybody on the back of the cover had long hair, and it was all we knew. It was called Jesus music. Little did I know at the time that album would have a tremendous impact on my life.
Holy, holy, holy is our Lord God Almighty.
We got something more than just salvation. If you will believe, then you will receive and feel the gift of love, and love from above is real.
Also featured on the sampler was a group of 4 young men who decided to have a go at making an entire album of this new thing known as Jesus music.
We went to a service one night and heard the gospel. That night, it all fell into place, and I realized that I didn't understand it all yet, but I became a Christian that night, and then we started playing at a Bible study at Calvary, and the ministry of love song grew out of that.
Lend an ear to a love song. Ooh, a love song. Let it take you, let it start.
In 1972, Chuck Girard, Tommy Coombs, Jay Truax, and Bob Wall released an album that was so fresh, it is still considered one of the classic contemporary Christian music albums of all time. The name of that group and their debut album was Love Song.
It's inaccurate to say that we were the first group or the first modern music group doing Christian lyrics, but I think it's safe to say that we were the first one to become nationally accepted. Larry Norman's album was out before ours, and there were other groups that were doing Christian music that didn't have records out. But as far as catapulting it into a national phenomena, we were the first, to have our album become very popular. In fact, the album became popular in spite of all the odds against it.
Lord, don't let us fight against each other. Let us be one in you. Sing unto the heavens with a brand new song.
Coming up, songs about Jesus make the pop charts and go to Broadway and beyond when CCM Magazine's History of Christian Music continues.
Music and ministry. We're 100.7 FM, KGPI.
Welcome back to CCM Magazine's History of Christian Music. I'm your host, Jon Rivers. A brother and sister trio who call themselves the Second Chapter of Acts released their first album to the Christian market in 1974. Annie Herring, Nellie Ward, and Matthew Ward had previously recorded 2 singles for MGM Records, one of which was cut on the eve of Matthew's 13th birthday. Under the guidance of Annie's husband, Buck, Second Chapter of Acts recorded with footnotes. which was selected by CCM Magazine's critics as one of the top 100 Christian albums of all time.
Hear the bells ringing, they're singing that we can be born again. You don't know which way the wind blows, so how can you plan tomorrow? Love, peace, joy. Stop thinking over again. We don't know when I see. We don't know when I see.
Some of the extraordinary keyboard work on second chapters with footnotes was performed by Michael O'Mardian, one of the most respected studio musicians and producers in Los Angeles. In 1974, the General Market ABC Dunhill label released O'Mardian's solo debut, White Horse. Brian Duncan is one of the many Christian artists who was influenced by O'Mardian's groundbreaking work.
I remember the White Horse record that O'Mardian first came out with. It was light years ahead of Christian music at that point. And I was just amazed. I was just completely, flipped about his stuff. And I played it endlessly.
Jeremiah, how your people cry, fancy. But I could be living on. If there's something more I could say, I would say it to you.
In the early 1970s, thousands of people were being introduced to contemporary Christian music at outdoor festivals. Within a few short years, festivals sprang up in dozens of locations throughout the United States and Europe. Theme parks such as Magic Mountain, Disneyland, Walt Disney World, and Knott's Berry Farm began sponsoring Christian music events. The result was that contemporary Christian music moved a giant step closer to meeting hundreds of thousands of people where they live.
I was running from my master, and I tried out every new thing that I could find.
Contemporary Christian music got another tremendous boost in 1975, spurred in part by the appearance of contemporary Christian radio and Christian music press. Harmony Magazine was one of the first such publications to attract a national audience.
The Eastern world, it is exploding, violence flaring, bullets loading. You're old enough to kill.
Prior to 1976, Barry McGuire, who had scored a #1 hit with his protest anthem, Eve of Destruction, was Christian music's most notable refugee from the pop market.
But you tell me over and over and over again, my friend, you don't believe we're on the eve of destruction.
But a flood of defections from the pop music world began to interest thousands of new listeners in contemporary Christian music. Former Buffalo Springfield and Poco member Richie Furay recorded the album I've Got a Reason for the mainstream Asylum label.
Like an arrow straight true. There ain't nothing you can do when the sight's on you. Am I getting with the moon?
B.J. Thomas announced his conversion in 1976 and recorded the album Home Where I Belong for Myrrh Records.
They say that heaven's pretty, and living here is too. But if they say that I would have to choose between the two, I'd go home. Going home where I belong.
In 1976, Word Records announced that it would distribute several independent labels, among them Larry Norman's Solid Rock Records. Larry Norman's best friend and musical compatriot throughout the 1970s was a young man named Randy Stonehill.
I had moved to Los Angeles in the summer of 1970 to seek my fame and fortune. And for the clarity of history, I had been dating Larry Norman's sister, far cuter than he is, and I think he would concur. Anyway, she had introduced me to him. We hit it off musically, and he said, "Look, why don't you come to town after you graduate from high school, and I'll show you the ropes of the music business." So the day I showed up at his house, through what really started out as a casual conversation, you know, like "How you doing?" kind of a thing, I had your textbook case lightning bolt experience in the spirit, and it turned my view of reality upside down.
I can see I am free, and I'm who I wanna be. Mercy me, mercy me, mercy me.
Randy's entry into contemporary Christian music came the following year with an independent album called Born Twice. Although Randy released an album in England in 1973, it would be 3 more years before Solid Rock issued Stonehill's next record. And when they did, it was a classic.
Here was a group of songs that had come from my heart and had been compiled over a number of years. And also the recording experience was still so fresh for me that they would just turn on the tape machine and I would just stand there in front of the microphone giving my heart.
And it's not hard to understand why we need a father's hand. There's a rainbow somewhere. You were born to be there. You're just running in circles.
CCM Magazine's critics selected Randy's Welcome to Paradise as one of the top 100 Christian music albums of all time. In the early 1970s, Phil Keaggy, a singer-songwriter from the mainstream band Glass Heart, created a buzz about his virtuoso guitar playing with a tireless touring schedule. 1976 saw the release of Love Broke Through, Keaggy's second solo album. The title track for Love Broke Through was composed by Randy Stonehill, Todd Fishkind, and an as yet unknown songwriter named Keith Green. The biggest industry news in 1976 was the departure of Billy Ray Hearn from Myrrh Records. Hearn left Waco, Texas for Southern California to start the Sparrow label. Sparrow's first artists included Barry McGuire, Annie Herring from Second Chapter of Acts, and John and Terry Talbot from the mainstream country rock band Mason Prophet. Within a year, the label would also sign Keith Green and release the classic album For Him Who Has Ears to Hear.
Takes care of the rest. Yes, the Lord said that He would take care of the rest. He's gonna do it because of you. You put a smile at me and they say, what a lucky guy. He's brought me here where things are clear and trials turn to gold. When I hear the praises start, oh, I wanna rain upon you blessings that will fill your heart. I see no stain upon you.
In 1976, country pop band Daniel Amos released its first album from Maranatha Music and was quickly well received. Daniel Amos leader Terry Taylor talks about the transition from the band's debut to its second album, Shotgun Angel.
We had time then to sort of stretch our legs and do what I had originally envisioned for the band to do, which was sort of be this surprise, sort of eclectic thing, much along the line of 60s radio, where the Beatles on one hand would do some beautiful ballad and then do a rocker over here, and then Stones and the way radio was. And I wanted the band to be sort of that vessel for that kind of creativity.
And you're a scared little child who dreams he falls, come fall in your father's arms. Got an angel riding shotgun, and he's riding with you all the way. Cool if we hit that living water. He's gonna do a number on you. I'm white horses to judge the earth. Posse in the sky, surely coming down.
Daniel Amos from the 1977 album Shotgun Angel. Newsweek magazine proclaimed 1977 the year of the evangelical in a cover story, while Teen magazine did a feature on this new thing called Jesus music. In the next 2 years, there would be a new magazine for Christian musicians and fans, and a new flurry of hits about God on the pop charts. That and more just ahead when CCM Magazine's History of Christian Music continues.
We're your inspiration station. 100.7 FM, KGBI.
Welcome back to CCM Magazine's History of Christian Music. I'm your host, Jon Rivers. 1977 also saw the release of a song about the resurrection that made an indelible mark on gospel music. It was recorded live in concert by Dallas Home and Praise, a group who toured for several years as part of David Wilkerson's Crusades. Rise Again is still recognized as one of the most loved songs in modern Christian music. '77 was also the year for a super hit by Debbie Boone, daughter of pop legend and Christian music entrepreneur Pat Boone. Debbie's recording of the motion picture theme You Light Up My Life went to number 1 on the Billboard singles chart and stayed there for 10 weeks, the biggest pop hit in 23 years. Down in Houston, Texas, Star Song Records was launched. When most contemporary Christian albums still consisted of mellow rock or pop, Star Song released Awaiting Your Reply by Resurrection Band, a hard rock group that was an outreach ministry of Jesus People USA, based in the inner city of Chicago.
We see wave after wave of people in the street playing their songs but missing the beat. You understand fools with no disguises and love so close at hand.
By 1978, it was apparent that contemporary Christian music needed a national voice to keep people posted on what was happening with the music. Harmony magazine had published 12 issues before it folded for good in 1977. Since 1976, a newspaper called Contemporary Christian Acts had been published by Jim and Betty Willems, owners of a large Southern California Christian book and gift store called Maranatha Village. In fact, the music coverage proved so popular that the publishers spun it off into its own paper, with local radio announcer John Still at the helm.
I became the editor of CCM Magazine really because I was in the right place at the right time. I had been the music editor of this other little tabloid newspaper because I knew some of the artists through my work in radio, knew something about the industry, but I knew nothing about publishing. And then when we decided to make a whole magazine based on music, I guess I was just there and became the editor, and it was really as simple as that.
Not only was Contemporary Christian Music an appropriate name for the publication, it would actually help determine once and for all the most popular name for the music.
I'm a believer in your love. I'm a believer
celebration of their new album, Debbie, Cherry, Laurie, and Lindy Boone graced the first cover of Contemporary Christian Music, published in July of 1978. The first issue cost a mere 50 cents and was sent to over 10,000 industry movers and shakers, including retail outlets and radio stations. Topping the charts that first issue were albums by the Second Chapter of Acts and Keith Green. The number one single at Contemporary Christian Radio was a story song called He's Alive, which catapulted Don Francisco into the forefront of Christian music. The song would later win Francisco 2 Dove Awards, the gospel music equivalent of the Grammy. Meanwhile, in Nashville, the talents of a high school freshman were just coming to light.
I was 15 at the time, and by the time I had maybe a dozen or so songs written, an older friend of mine helped me find some studio time to make a cassette of my songs. When this friend of mine was running off a copy of that cassette, a man named Chris Christian walked into the studio and said, who is that? And it wasn't even very good. It was just a real simple tape. Chris had been on a couple of dates with one of my older sisters, and so the guy at the board in the studio said, well, that's Amy Grant. And, Chris said, you're kidding. And he'd just gotten permission from Word Records to find some new artists. And Chris called Word Records and played my tape over the phone. And they called me back a few days later with the offer of a record deal.
In March of 1978, when she was just 17, her first album was released. And it wasn't long before everyone was talking about Amy Grant.
There's beautiful music flowing on through me just like you. Are you living in an old man's trouble? Are you listening to the father of lies? If you are, then you're headed for trouble. And I'd love to live on a mountaintop, fellowshipping with the Lord.
Not all contemporary Christian music came out of Nashville or California. Eddie DeGarmo and Dana Key were lifelong friends who grew up in Memphis. In 1978, DeGarmo and Key recorded their first album of Christian rock for Pat Boone's Lamb and Lion label. Their second album, Straight On, was released in 1979. DeGarmo and Key faced a great deal of opposition for the style of music they played, as did many Christian rock artists.
It was new that the church was being introduced into rock and roll. They really didn't know what to make of it. When we took rock and roll into the church for the first time, they were scared to death. You learn that there's more roads to be right than just one when it comes to cultural things.
But here I am, talking about Jesus just the same. I've been knocked down, kicked around, but like a moth drawn to the flame. Here I am, talking about Jesus just the same. Whoa.
Very early in its history, CCM Magazine addressed the volatile subject of the validity of rock music as a means of expressing one's faith. In a special three-part series, evangelists Jimmy Swaggart and J. Vernon McGee were among those who spoke out vehemently against Christian rock. McGee was afraid that Christian rock concerts were taking the place of Bible studies, while Swaggart went so far as to call Christian rock spiritual fornication. Those coming down on the side of Christian rockers were Dana Key, who called rock music a neutral means of communication, and Bill Gaither, who felt that many times the things that divide us in the body of Christ are cultural, not theological.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome
It quickly became obvious that if contemporary Christian music were to survive, the religious culture which spawned the music was going to have to develop a sense of humor about itself. And there to help Christianity grow a funny bone was Isaac Airfreight with its zany debut disc, Fun in the Sun. Isaac Airfreight with some Fun in the Sun. You're listening to CCM Magazine's History of Christian Music. 1979 saw the introduction of Sony's Walkman cassette player, an electronic device that would revolutionize the way people around the world listen to music.
All things are possible with you by my side. All things are possible with you to be my guide.
Dan Peake, one of the founding members of the pop trio America, released All Things Are Possible, his first Christian disc, in late 1978. Early in 1979, the title track charted on the Billboard magazine Hot 100. With the release of her second album, My Father's Eyes, Amy Grant made her first appearance on the cover of CCM Magazine.
I don't think I thought about my music as a budding career. It just seemed like making music was my hobby. I was very involved in the youth group at church, and one was just a real natural extension of the other.
Got her father's eyes, her father's eyes, eyes that find the good in things when good is not around.
Also that summer, Petra began touring in support of its album, Washes Whiter Than, the first disc to feature Greg X. Bowles as lead vocalist.
Why should the Father bother to call us his children? Why should the Spirit hear it when we pray?
In September, the political establishment in Washington, D.C. took notice of contemporary Christian music. A concert on the South Lawn of the White House featured Larry Norman, Barry McGuire, and several other Southern gospel, pop, and black gospel artists singing for President Jimmy Carter, his wife Rosalind, and many of the White House staff.
Have you had Jesus people knocking on your door, saying things you never heard before? But don't you get uptight, things will be all right. 'Cause it won't be long, they'll be gone.
Coming up, one of the most influential artists in the history of pop music turns to Christ. One of Christian music's most charismatic figures announces he will no longer put a price tag on his music, and Michael W. Smith makes his debut. That's all ahead when CCM Magazine's History of Christian Music continues. Listening to CCM Magazine's History of Christian Music. I'm your host, Jon Rivers. A major turning point in pop music came in 1979 when rumors of Bob Dylan's conversion to Christianity appeared confirmed by the content of Dylan's album Slow Train Coming. The Christian music world, as well as the mainstream music community, took note of Dylan's powerful musical statement of Christianity. Here was an artist recognized by many as the most influential songwriter in modern music, now singing about Jesus.
And what you've given me today is worth more than I can pay. And no matter what they say, I believe in you.
As the last page turned on the decade of the 1970s, most Christian music artists were still trying to determine what their role in the music's future would be. In the January 1979 issue of CCM Magazine, Kevin Thompson of Sweet Comfort Band said, "We don't want to be known as a gospel band. We want to be known as a band of guys who are Christians." That statement would be repeated by dozens, if not hundreds, of artists over the next 20 years.
I'm just sitting here watching the wheels go round and round. I really love to watch them roll.
The murder of former Beatle John Lennon in New York cast a grim shadow over the excitement surrounding the beginning of the 1980s. Ronald Reagan was elected president. The USA hockey team upset Russia during the Winter Olympics en route to a gold medal. The Who Shot JR episode of the Dallas TV series captured record ratings, and CNN became the first all-news TV service. Landing on the cover of the first issue of CCM Magazine of the 1980s was Daniel Amos with its new album, Horrendous Disc. The band would complete its transition from country rock combo to new wave alternative band. Daniel Amos leader Terry Taylor says he really wasn't aware of how big a leap the band was taking.
I didn't really have that much self-awareness in terms of, oh, this is monumental or this is really going to impact people. We basically had the same band now for 20 years, but it's the same thing. It's not, gee, what are those people out there going to think? We're making a real leap here. It seems natural. It's just like, let's explore, let's have fun, let's have something to say, let's experiment.
The Imperials, with 25 albums already to their credit, took a further turn toward a pop sound with the release of One More Song for You, which featured the sterling production of Michael O'Mardian.
But you're gonna have to serve somebody. Yes, indeed, you're gonna have to serve somebody. Well, it may be the devil or it may be the Lord, but you're gonna have to serve somebody.
The highlight of the 1980 Grammy Awards telecast came when Bob Dylan performed Gotta Serve Somebody, which won the award for Best Male Rock Vocal Performance. It was Dylan's first Grammy.
I didn't expect this, and I want to thank the Lord for it. And most likely I want to also thank Jerry Wexler, Barry Beckett, who believed in it. So thank you.
And though critics remain skeptical about the newfound faith displayed on Slow Train Coming, Bob Dylan seemed to end all the speculation with his second post-conversion album, Saved. 1980 was also the year for the album Truth Decay by T-Bone Burnett, who had toured with Dylan as part of the famous Rolling Thunder Revue in the mid-1970s.
If you're a Christian, there are two kinds of songs you can write, or there's two ways you can write. You can either write about the light, or you can write about what you see by the light. I suppose I do the latter. I'm trying to make good music for God's sake. He's given us talents, and he wants us to make them multiply.
Can make a skeptic believe. The power of love is south of south and scorches out all the doubt. The power of love is the name of names.
T-Bone Burnett was one of several Christian artists who approached their music from a Christian perspective without necessarily being evangelical. There were lyrical hints of their faith, but many of their songs were more subtle than those of most of their counterparts on Christian music labels. Canadian Bruce Cockburn was another of those artists. He was highly regarded in his home country, but the U.S. hadn't heard much of him before his 1980 hit, Wondering Where the Lions Are.
I got my mind on eternity. Some kind of ecstasy got a hold on me, and I'm wondering where the lions are. I'm wondering where the lions are. I'm wondering where the lions are.
With all the awards and crosses crossover, was Christian music getting too commercial? Was it being priced out of the reach of those who needed to hear it? Was there too much business interfering with the ministry? Well, Keith Green thought so. In a March 1980 CCM Magazine cover story, Keith made the shocking announcement that he would offer his albums to be released by his own Pretty Good Records label at whatever price people could afford, even if that meant giving them away.
So you want to go back to Egypt, where it's warm and secure. Are you sorry about the one-way ticket when you thought you were sure?
By August, Keith Green's Last Days Ministries reported shipping over 100,000 copies of So You Want to Go Back to Egypt. The organization would eventually fulfill close to 200,000 orders, with nearly a third of those copies sent out for free.
Jesus has gone to prepare me a mansion way up on Glory Avenue.
Despite the validation of crossover success and critical acclaim, contemporary Christian music had not silenced its critics. Evangelist Jimmy Swaggart, in his monthly publication, The Evangelist, leveled a number of unfounded accusations not only against Christian music, but those who enjoy it. CCM Magazine publisher John Still responded in his September editorial.
Well, back in 1980, when that editorial was written, Jimmy Swaggart was still a person of considerable influence in the evangelical world. And for him to take the cover story of his magazine, which had a circulation of almost 500,000, and just blindside everyone in Christian music with categorical statements that said things like, I emphatically state that it's impossible to touch anyone's heart with contemporary music. It's impossible to worship God with contemporary music. I felt he had stepped out of bounds, and I called him on it.
In 1985, Still and Swaggart addressed some of these issues in a face-to-face meeting, but Swaggart would remain adamant in much of his criticism. One of the main songwriters for the progressive rock band Kansas, delivered his first solo album, Seeds of Change, which contained 7 songs about his recent conversion, to the folks at CBS Records without any explanation of the content. Given the fact that Livgren was largely responsible for Kansas selling 10 million records in 10 years, the label didn't ask many questions. Paragon Music announced the signing of their first staff writer, a young composer named Michael Smith. The W was inadvertently left out of the news report. Said the item, Michael will write as well as pitch tunes for Paragon Music.
I loaded up that old beat-up Chevrolet and stuffed that mattress in the back and left my mom and dad crying on the porch, and I came to Nashville to write songs. I'll never forget, it was September of 1980, and they paid me $200 a week, and I thought I'd died and gone to heaven. I didn't wait tables, didn't have to work at Coca-Cola, I didn't have to plant shrubs. I mean, I was actually in the studio probably 12 to 14 hours a day. I just ate it up. I wrote a lot of songs. That year I wrote 105 songs, which I would probably be embarrassed to play about 100 of them for you. I'd say maybe 5 of them turned out to be pretty good songs. But, you're learning, you're young, and it was just a learning process. And those were very, very memorable days for me.
You can have peace if you want it. Whatever it is you want from him, you can get it. You can have peace.
As 1980 drew to a close, BET, Black Entertainment Television, added the Bobby Jones Gospel Show, the first totally commercially sponsored gospel music show in the U.S., and Bob Dylan continued to stun longtime supporters by performing mostly gospel material in his concerts. In 1981, the barriers between mainstream and Christian music would continue to fall. We'll cover that trend and other events as CCM Magazine's History of Christian Music continues.